Rain poured over the empty streets of Blackthorn as a terrified waitress stood trembling inside an old phone booth, her arm shattered and her world collapsing around her. Moments earlier, the man she once trusted had broken her arm and left her bleeding in the alley. With nowhere else to go, she made one desperate call to a number she had never dared to use. When the voice answered, calm and ancient, she whispered the only words she had left. "Can you come get me?" What she didn't realize was that the man on the other end of that phone wasn't just anyone. He was the vampire king of the entire city. And tonight, someone was about to learn a terrifying lesson about hurting what belongs to him. She had endured pain in silence for years, but the night her ex broke her arm, one trembling phone call awakened the most dangerous protector in the dark. Lena Hart had learned long ago that survival often looked quiet from the outside. It looked like lowering her eyes when customers shouted at her for cold coffee she had not brewed. It looked like smiling through double shifts at the Silver Lantern Diner while their feet ached inside worn shoes and her stomach twisted from hunger. It looked like hiding bruises under long sleeves and pretending she had bumped into doors when people noticed the fading marks near her wrists. In the city of Blackthorn, no one asked too many questions, because questions invited trouble, and trouble had sharp teeth. Lena knew this better than anyone. She had spent 2 years trapped in the orbit of Mason Crow, the man who once promised her safety, and then slowly turned into the reason she feared going home at night. That evening the rain had started before sunset, a hard freezing rain that rattled the diner windows and turned the neon sign outside into a pink blur. Inside, the diner smelled of grease, earned onions, and cheap coffee, but Lena preferred that over the bitter cologne Mason wore. He had come in just before closing, sober and smiling, which frightened her more than shouting ever could. Mason only smiled when he had already decided to hurt someone. He sat in the last booth and watched her move between tables with the lazy patience of a wolf waiting for a wounded animal to stumble. Her manager noticed him and instantly disappeared into the kitchen, suddenly busy with dishes that did not need washing. No one wanted to get involved. No one ever did. When Lena finally stepped into the back hallway to grab her coat, Mason followed her. The hallway was narrow, dim, and lined with boxes of canned soup and bleach bottles stacked against the wall. She turned when she heard his boots, and before she could speak, he grabbed her by the arm. His fingers dug into her skin as his face twisted with insulted pride. He accused her of ignoring his calls, of acting too proud now, of forgetting who had taken care of her when she had nothing. Lena tried to pull free, her voice shaking as she told him to let go, but Mason's anger rose the moment he heard resistance. He yanked her harder. There was a sickening crack, sharp and unnatural, and pain exploded through her left arm so violently that her knees almost gave out beneath her. For one awful second, the world went white. She heard herself cry out, but the sound felt far away, drowned beneath the roaring in her ears. Mason stepped back, breathing hard, staring at her with something colder than rage. There was no guilt in his expression, only irritation, as if her pain had inconvenienced him. Lena cradled her broken arm against her chest and slid down the wall, gasping while tears blurred the shelves and concrete floor into a smear of gray. He crouched in front of her and told her in a low voice that she had forced him to do it, that she belonged to him, that if she told anyone, he would make things worse next time. Then he stood and walked out through the rear exit, not because he was finished, but because he knew she was too frightened to run. He expected her to stay exactly where he had left her, broken and obedient, but Lena was tired of obedience. With her good hand shaking uncontrollably, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a black card she had carried for nearly 3 years. It had no number written on it, only a silver crest like a crown wrapped in thorns. She remembered the man who had given it to her on a winter night when the diner had been almost empty. He had sat alone in a corner booth, pale and still, with eyes like dark violets under moonlight. He had looked less like a customer and more like a secret wearing human skin. She had given him her own meal because he looked like someone standing one breath away from collapse. Before leaving, he had placed the card in her palm and said, "If the night ever becomes too heavy for you, call me." She had thought of him many times after that, but never once believed she would be desperate enough to use it. Now desperation was all she had left. She stumbled through the back door into the rain, biting down on her lip to stop herself from screaming as each movement sent fresh agony through her arm. Across the street stood an old pay-phone half hidden beneath a flickering lamp. She crossed to it, drenched and shivering, her breath breaking in uneven gasps. The city around her felt empty, as though even the storm had stepped back to watch. She lifted the receiver, dialed the number she had memorized years ago, and pressed her forehead to the cold glass while it rang. Once, twice, then a deep, calm voice answered. "Who is this?" Lena swallowed hard, tears mixing with rain on her face. "It's Lena," she whispered. "You told me once. If the world tried to crush me, I didn't have to face it alone." Her voice cracked, but she forced the words out. "Can you come get me?" There was a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the storm itself. Then the voice returned, colder and more powerful than memory had preserved. "Stay where you are, Lena. I am coming." She closed her eyes in relief, but as she lowered the receiver, she heard footsteps splashing through the alley behind her. Slow, familiar, deliberate. Mason had come back, and this time he was not alone. Asterisk, the man who answered her desperate call was not just a stranger from the past. He was the most feared vampire king in Blackthorn, and he had already arrived. The rain poured harder as Lena slowly lowered the payphone receiver, her heart still racing from the calm but terrifying promise in the man's voice. "Stay where you are. I am coming." Those words echoed inside her mind, but fear quickly drowned the small comfort they brought. From the dark mouth of the alley behind the phone booth came the sound of boots splashing through. Puddles, heavy, slow, familiar. Lena's stomach tightened as she turned her head slightly and saw Mason's silhouette step into the weak glow of the streetlight. But he was not alone anymore. Two large men followed behind him, their shapes bulky beneath thick jackets, their faces hidden under the rain and shadow. Mason wiped rain from his forehead and stared at her through the glass of the phone booth, his expression twisted with a cruel smile that made Lena's breath catch in her throat. He looked less angry now and more amused, like a hunter who had just rediscovered prey that tried to escape. "You really thought you could run from me?" Mason called through the storm, his voice carrying easily over the rain. Lena pressed herself against the glass wall of the booth, clutching her injured arm tightly against her chest as the pain pulsed through her body like fire. She wanted to scream, to run, to disappear, but her legs felt weak and heavy. Mason walked closer, the puddles rippling around his boots, while the two men spread out behind him like silent guards. His eyes dropped briefly to her arm, and he chuckled softly. "Looks worse than I expected," he said casually, tilting his head. "You should have just listened to me, Lena. I hate it when you make things difficult." The two men behind him laughed quietly, their deep voices blending with the thunder rolling across the sky. Lena shook her head weakly, her voice trembling as she tried to stand. "Please just leave me alone," she whispered, though she knew Mason never listened to pleas. Mason stepped closer to the booth, placing one hand against the wet glass while staring directly into her terrified eyes. "You don't get to ask for things," he replied softly. "You belong to me. And tonight you embarrassed me." His other hand slowly lifted something long and metallic from his coat. Under the streetlight, Lena saw the dull shine of a crowbar. Her breath stopped. Mason tapped it lightly against the pavement, as if testing its weight. "You broke one arm already," he said calmly. "Maybe I should fix the other one so they match." Lena felt her legs give out, and she slid down the inside of the booth. Her back pressed against the glass, while rain hammered against the roof above her. Her mind screamed for help, but the street was empty. No cars passed. No lights turned on in nearby buildings. It was as if the entire district had chosen not to exist tonight. Mason opened the booth door slowly, letting the rain pour inside while he stepped closer. The two men behind him watched eagerly, their shadows stretching across the wet pavement. Mason raised the crowbar slightly, his smile widening, as Lena curled against the corner of the booth. Then something changed. The air itself seemed to tighten, like the moment before lightning strikes. The rain slowed strangely, the falling drops hanging in the air just a fraction longer than they should. Mason paused mid-step, his smile fading as he looked over Lena's shoulder toward the dark end of the street. A deep silence rolled across the alley, heavy and unnatural. Even the thunder seemed to retreat. Lena turned slowly, her heart pounding, and saw a tall figure standing beneath the broken streetlight behind the phone booth. He had not walked there. He had simply appeared. The man held a black umbrella that shielded him perfectly from the storm. His long charcoal coat moved slightly in the wind, and his pale face seemed almost luminous in the dim light. His eyes, glowing faintly violet, were fixed on Mason with calm but terrifying focus. Lena recognized him instantly. 3 years had passed, but she would never forget that face. Ambrose Greyhaven. The vampire king took one slow step forward, the umbrella tilting slightly as his voice cut through the storm like quiet thunder. "You heard the lady," he said coldly. "She asked me to come get her." Mason frowned, clearly confused, but still arrogant. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" he demanded, tightening his grip on the crowbar. Ambrose looked at the weapon briefly before meeting Mason's eyes again, and the faint smile that appeared on his lips made Lena's blood run cold. He said softly, "I'm the worst mistake you will ever make." And in the next second, Ambrose vanished from the streetlight and appeared directly behind Mason. In a single blink, the man who had terrified Lena for years realized he was no longer the hunter. He had become the prey. Mason felt a sudden chill crawl up his spine the moment the stranger disappeared from the streetlight. 1 second the tall man had been standing several feet away beneath the broken lamp, and the next moment he was simply gone. The rain continued to fall heavily, splashing across the pavement and the glass of the phone booth where Lena sat trembling. But the silence that followed felt unnatural, thick, and suffocating. Mason tightened his grip on the crowbar and spun around quickly, his eyes scanning the empty street with growing confusion. Where did he go? One of the men behind him muttered nervously, his voice no longer confident. Mason opened his mouth to shout something angry, but the words froze inside his throat when he felt a presence standing directly behind him. Slowly, very slowly, he turned his head. Ambrose Greyhaven stood only inches away, his tall figure towering calmly over Mason, as if he had always been there. Rain slid off the edges of his umbrella without touching him, and his violet eyes glowed faintly in the dim streetlight. Mason staggered back instinctively, shock flashing across his face before anger quickly replaced it. "You think you're funny?" Mason snapped, raising the crowbar defensively. "You scared me for a second, but you picked the wrong night to play hero." The two men behind Mason moved forward cautiously, though the unease in their expressions was impossible to hide. Ambrose said nothing for a moment. His gaze shifted briefly past Mason to the phone booth, where Lena watched with wide, frightened eyes. She could see something ancient and powerful behind his calm expression, something far older than the storm surrounding them. Ambrose finally looked back at Mason, studying him with the quiet patience of someone examining a broken object. "You hurt her," he said softly. The simple sentence carried more weight than a shouted threat. Mason scoffed loudly, trying to laugh off the strange tension that had settled over the alley. "She's my girlfriend," he replied with a shrug. "If I break something that belongs to me, that's none of your business." The moment the words left his mouth, something in Ambrose's expression changed. The faint smile vanished, replaced by a cold stillness that made even the rain seem to hesitate. Mason suddenly felt the urge to step backward again, though he forced himself to stay where he stood. Ambrose lowered his umbrella slowly, letting the rain fall around them while his eyes remained locked on Mason. "She does not belong to you," he said quietly. Mason lifted the crowbar higher. "Listen, rich boy," he snapped, irritation rising in his voice. "Walk away before I teach you a lesson." Without warning, Mason swung the crowbar toward Ambrose's head with all his strength. Lena gasped inside the booth, certain she was about to witness something terrible. But Ambrose did not dodge. He simply raised one pale hand and caught the metal bar mid-swing. The impact should have shattered bone, but instead the crowbar stopped completely, as if it had struck solid stone. Mason stared at the weapon in disbelief, while Ambrose examined it with mild curiosity. "Such a crude tool," Ambrose murmured. Then, with slow, deliberate pressure, he began bending the steel bar with his bare fingers. The metal groaned loudly before folding like soft clay. Mason's face drained of color as the twisted crowbar slipped from his hand and clattered uselessly to the pavement. One of the men behind him cursed and stepped back. The other turned and ran down the alley without a second thought. Mason tried to retreat as well, but Ambrose stepped forward, his presence blocking the path like a wall. "You broke something that was under my protection," Ambrose continued calmly, his voice quiet but filled with authority that made the air vibrate. "In my world, that carries consequences." Mason's bravado finally cracked as he stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the brick wall of the alley. "What are you?" he whispered hoarsely. Ambrose leaned slightly closer, his violet eyes glowing brighter in the darkness. "I am the reason monsters like you learn fear." Before Mason could react, a sleek black car rolled silently into the alley and stopped beside the phone booth. The driver's door opened, and a tall woman stepped out wearing a dark suit that barely concealed the powerful muscles beneath it. Her copper hair was tied tightly behind her head, and a long scar crossed one of her eyes. She looked briefly at Ambrose before nodding with quiet respect. "Your Majesty," she said calmly. "The car is ready." Lena's heart skipped when she heard the title. "Your Majesty." Ambrose turned toward the booth and gently opened the door, his voice suddenly softer than before. "Miss Hart," he said, "may I escort you somewhere safe?" Lena hesitated only a moment before stepping toward him, still cradling her injured arm. But as Ambrose helped her into the back seat of the car, he glanced briefly toward the dark end of the alley. Hidden deep within the shadows, another pair of pale eyes had been watching everything. Lena thought the nightmare was finally over when the young vampire king saved her. But the moment she entered his world, she discovered the danger had only just begun. The black car moved silently through the rain-soaked streets of Blackthorn, its engine so smooth that Lena barely felt the motion as the city lights blurred past the tinted windows. The warmth inside the vehicle felt unreal compared to the cold terror she had just escaped, yet her heart still pounded violently in her chest. Her broken arm throbbed with every breath, the pain sharp and relentless, reminding her that the nightmare was not a dream she could wake from. Ambrose Greyhaven sat across from her on the opposite side of the spacious back seat, his posture perfectly composed, his pale face calm in a way that made the chaos of the past few minutes feel strangely distant. The tall woman who had stepped from the driver's seat earlier now guided the vehicle through the empty streets with quiet precision. Lena heard Ambrose address her softly. "Tanith," he said, "take us home." Tanith nodded once without turning her head. Lena remained silent for a moment, unsure what to say to the man who had just crushed a steel crowbar with his bare hand as if it were made of paper. Her mind struggled to accept what she had seen. Finally, she forced herself to speak. "Thank you," she whispered weakly, her voice trembling. Ambrose looked at her injured arm first, before meeting her eyes. His violet gaze was intense, but not cruel. "You should not thank me yet," he replied quietly. "Your injury requires immediate treatment." Lena shook her head instinctively. "Hospitals cost money," she said automatically. Years of survival speaking for her before logic could catch up. Ambrose studied her expression carefully, and for a brief moment something almost human flickered in his eyes. "We will not be going to a hospital," he answered calmly. Lena frowned slightly, confused, but before she could ask more questions, the car turned onto a winding road that climbed steeply out of the city. The neon lights of Blackthorn slowly disappeared behind them, replaced by dark forests and towering stone walls that seemed centuries old. The rain softened into a thin mist as they passed through enormous iron gates that opened silently the moment Tanith approached. Lena leaned closer to the window, despite the pain in her arm. Ahead of them stood a massive estate built from black stone and glass, perched high above the cliffs overlooking the restless ocean. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the structure in a cold silver glow. The place looked less like a home and more like a fortress, built for creatures that did not fear storms. The car stopped beneath a covered entrance where several tall figures already waited silently in the shadows. Tanith stepped out first and opened Lena's door with surprising gentleness. "Careful with your arm," she said quietly. Lena hesitated before stepping out of the car, her legs slightly unsteady from shock and exhaustion. Ambrose walked beside her without touching her, though his presence felt strangely protective. They moved quickly through wide marble corridors until they entered a bright medical room filled with equipment that looked far more advanced than anything Lena had ever seen. A silver-haired woman stood beside a metal table, washing her hands slowly. When she turned, Lena noticed her eyes were completely black, as dark and endless as deep water. "This is Dr. Celesta," Ambrose said calmly. "She will help you." Lena sat carefully on the examination bed while Celeste approached without hesitation. The doctor gently examined Lena's arm, her fingers cold but precise as she pressed along the bone. "Spiral fracture," she said flatly. "Painful but repairable." Lena blinked in confusion. "Repairable?" she repeated weakly. Celesta did not answer. Instead, she placed both hands carefully over Lena's broken arm. "This will hurt," she said quietly. The next moment, Lena felt something like lightning tear through her body. Pain exploded through her arm, as if the bone itself had been pulled apart and forced back together again. She screamed, despite trying to stay quiet, gripping the edges of the bed while Tanith held her shoulders steady. Ambrose stood beside her, murmuring something in a strange ancient language that made the air vibrate softly around them. Slowly the pain began to change, fading from burning agony into a deep numb warmth. Lena's breathing slowed as the sensation spread through her arm like flowing water. After several minutes, Celesta stepped back calmly. "It is done," she said simply. Lena stared down at her arm in disbelief. The bone was no longer broken. Bruises remained, but the horrible twisting pain had vanished completely. As she flexed her fingers carefully, she noticed something glowing faintly beneath the skin of her wrist. A delicate violet symbol had appeared there, shaped like a dragon, coiled protectively around a blooming rose. Lena looked up in shock. "What is this?" she asked. Ambrose's expression changed the moment he saw the mark. The calm confidence vanished from his face, replaced by genuine alarm. Celesta's dark eyes widened slightly as well. That, Ambrose whispered slowly, should not exist. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? She asked quietly. Ambrose looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Because, he said carefully, that mark only appears on someone the Greyhaven estate recognizes as its queen. And far away in the darkness of Blackthorn, Mason Crow was kneeling before a pale woman dressed entirely in white, begging for power to take Lena back. While Lena struggled to understand the mysterious mark on her wrist, the man who once terrorized her was already making a deal with something far darker than revenge. The Greyhaven estate was silent that night, but Lena could not sleep. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed inside the guest room Tanith had prepared for her, staring at the faint violet symbol glowing beneath the skin of her wrist. The dragon and rose crest pulsed slowly like a heartbeat, casting a soft light across her fingers whenever the room grew dark. Every time she touched the mark, a strange warmth spread through her arm, not painful but powerful, as if the estate itself were breathing through her veins. She remembered Ambrose's words clearly. The house recognizes you as its queen. The thought made no sense. She was just a waitress who spent most nights serving cheap coffee and wiping tables. Nothing about her life belonged in a castle overlooking the ocean. Yet the house seemed to react to her presence. Earlier that evening, when she had walked into the long marble hallway, the chandeliers above her had brightened instantly as if greeting her arrival. Downstairs in the estate's great library, Ambrose Greyhaven stood near the tall windows, overlooking the black ocean waves crashing against the cliffs. Tanith waited beside him, arms crossed, her sharp eyes studying the storm outside. The mark appeared naturally? She asked quietly. Ambrose nodded once, his expression darker than usual. I did not give her my blood, he replied. The bond formed on its own. Tanith frowned slightly. That has never happened before. Ambrose turned toward the window again, his violet eyes reflecting the lightning flashing across the sea. The Greyhaven magic is always chosen carefully, he murmured, but never without reason. Tanith opened her mouth to reply, but before she could speak, a deep vibration echoed faintly through the stone walls of the mansion. Both of them felt it immediately. It was not thunder. It was something older, far away in the ruined industrial district of Blackthorn. Mason Crow knelt on the cold concrete floor of an abandoned warehouse. His breathing was uneven, his body trembling as he stared at the tall woman standing in front of him. She wore an elegant white dress untouched by the dirt and shadows surrounding her, and her pale hair fell like silver over her shoulders. The air around her felt colder than the winter storm outside. Mason had once believed himself to be powerful in the streets of Blackthorn, but standing before this woman made him feel smaller than a child. You said you would help me, Mason whispered hoarsely. You said you could make me strong enough to take her back. The woman smiled slowly, revealing teeth just slightly too sharp to be human. I did say that, she replied softly. Her name was Lady Seraphine, one of the oldest members of the White Court, a rival bloodline that had opposed the Greyhaven family for centuries. She stepped closer to Mason, studying him like a scientist examining a flawed experiment. The girl now lives under Ambrose Greyhaven's protection, she continued calmly. Taking her back will not be easy. Mason's eyes burned with desperate obsession. I don't care how difficult it is, he snapped. She belongs to me. Seraphine laughed softly at the word belongs. Such confidence for a creature so fragile, she said gently. Then she lifted a delicate silver vial filled with a thick dark liquid. But perhaps I can give you the strength you need. Mason stared at the vial, his heart pounding. What is it? He asked nervously. Seraphine tilted the vial slightly, letting the black liquid swirl slowly inside. "Ancient blood," she replied. "A gift from the White Court." Mason hesitated for only a second before grabbing the vial and drinking it in one desperate swallow. The reaction was immediate. His body convulsed violently as black veins spread across his neck and arms like burning cracks in stone. He screamed, collapsing onto the floor as his muscles twisted and expanded beneath his skin. Seraphine watched calmly while the transformation took hold. Her cold smile never fading. Hours later, Mason stood again, breathing heavily as rain leaked through the broken roof of the warehouse. His reflection in a shattered mirror looked almost monstrous. His eyes had turned pale white, and his body had grown larger, stronger, something barely human anymore. Seraphine stepped beside him, pleased with the result. "Now," she whispered softly, "you may challenge the Vampire King." Back at Greyhaven Estate, Lena suddenly woke with a sharp gasp. The glowing mark on her wrist burned brighter than before, sending a strange warning sensation through her body. She ran toward the tall balcony doors and looked down across the dark valley leading toward the mansion gates. In the distance, she could see something moving through the storm. Something large and fast, crashing through the trees. At that same moment, deep below the estate, the ancient defensive bells of Greyhaven began to ring. The girl who once trembled in a diner now stood at the gates of a vampire kingdom, facing the monster who believed he still owned her. The ancient bells of Greyhaven echoed through the entire estate, like a warning from another century. Their deep metallic sound rolled through the halls, vibrating through the stone floors and tall windows as thunder crashed above the cliffs. Lena stood frozen on the balcony, her heart racing while the glowing mark on her wrist pulsed faster, almost painfully, as if it were reacting to something approaching the estate. The forest below the cliffs shook violently as something massive forced its way through the trees. Branches snapped. The ground trembled. Lena felt the strange connection with the house growing stronger, like invisible threads pulling at her instincts. She did not fully understand the power tied to the Greyhaven estate, but she knew one thing clearly in that moment. Something dangerous was coming directly for her. Behind her, the balcony doors burst open, and Ambrose stepped out, his expression sharper than she had ever seen it. Tanith followed immediately, holding a long silver blade that glowed faintly in the lightning flashes. "You should be in the safe room," Tanith said firmly. Lena shook her head, her eyes locked on the dark forest below. "It's him," she whispered. The mark on her wrist burned brighter, as if confirming her words. Ambrose moved closer to the railing and stared into the storm. A few seconds later, the massive iron gates of the estate exploded open with a deafening crash. A huge figure stepped through the broken entrance, walking slowly toward the mansion across the rain-soaked courtyard. It was Mason, but he barely looked human anymore. His body had grown unnaturally large, his muscles stretching his torn clothes, while dark veins pulsed beneath gray skin. His eyes glowed a ghostly white, and his mouth twisted into a hungry grin that revealed sharp, unnatural teeth. Rain slid across his monstrous form as he lifted his head and roared Lena's name across the valley. The sound was deep and distorted, like grinding stone echoing through a cave. Lena felt a wave of fear rise in her chest, but strangely, it did not control her the way it once had. Instead, the estate beneath her feet hummed with power, responding to her emotions like a living creature. Ambrose turned toward her. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "This fight is mine." Lena looked at him for a long moment, remembering the diner, the broken arm, and the years she had spent afraid of the man now marching across the courtyard. Something inside her finally snapped free from the fear she had carried for so long. She stepped forward instead of back. "No," she said softly. Ambrose frowned slightly. "Lena," she raised her glowing wrist and interrupted him. house chose me," she continued, her voice steady despite the storm. "Then let me face him." Before Ambrose could argue, Lena walked past him and stepped onto the stone staircase leading down to the courtyard. The rain soaked her hair instantly, but she did not stop walking. Mason's monstrous eyes locked onto her the moment she appeared. "There you are," he growled happily. "I knew you'd come back to me." Lena stopped several feet away from him, her heart pounding but her voice calm. "You never owned me," she replied. Mason laughed, lifting his massive hand as if reaching to grab her. "You were always mine," he snarled. The moment he lunged forward, the dragon and rose mark on Lena's wrist exploded with brilliant violet light. The ground beneath the courtyard trembled violently as the Greyhaven estate responded to her will. Stone gargoyles along the walls suddenly shifted, their ancient eyes glowing as if waking from a centuries-old sleep. Massive iron chains burst from the ground around Mason's feet like living serpents, wrapping tightly around his legs and dragging him violently to his knees. Mason roared in fury, struggling against the magical restraints, but the estate's power was stronger than his stolen strength. Ambrose stepped forward slowly, his violet eyes cold as winter as he looked down at the restrained monster. "Your war ends here," the Vampire King said quietly. Mason tried to speak, but the chains tightened further until he could barely breathe. With a final gesture from Ambrose, the chains dragged Mason backward across the courtyard and down into the darkness of the estate's ancient underground prison, sealing the gates behind him forever. Silence slowly returned to the courtyard as the storm began to fade. Lena stood there breathing heavily, her glowing wrist slowly dimming as the estate settled back into quiet watchfulness. Ambrose approached her carefully, studying her with a mixture of awe and respect. For the first time since they had met, he bowed his head slightly. "You are no longer just a guest here," he said softly. "Greyhaven has chosen its queen." Lena looked at the rising sunlight breaking through the clouds above the ocean. Cliffs, realizing that the life she once knew was gone forever. But a new destiny had only just begun.